The story about Zacchaeus is one that you may, if you grew up in a church school, may remember. There's a song about Zacchaeus climbing up in the tree, being so short in order to see Jesus. And as we hear this scripture, we hear, again, just that. It's a great visual scripture for the children to think about, to sing, and for people like me and a few others that I won't point out, being short is a condition in life that we just struggle with. When I lined up for the choir, I always knew where I was going to stand, front row. So that I could see, because I was short. But it does describe Zacchaeus here as short. One commentator I was listening to this week said, not necessarily specifically short, but it said Zacchaeus was diminished. And is often interpreted diminutive, being short, but he was diminished in some way. And so we find him because of that. And you may relate to this if you've been in a crowd trying to see some event, whether it's a parade or whatnot, of being in the back of the crowd and not being able to see what's going on. It's just impossible. They tell me what's going on there. Perhaps when I was really young, I could ride on my dad's shoulders, and that would give me a better vantage point. You can kind of relate to Zacchaeus here, I'm just not tall enough to see. And so it says he runs ahead to climb that tree. But I think it's a two-part problem here. One part is the height, the stature of Zacchaeus, that he's not towering over everybody else. He's diminished in some ways, diminutive. But I think there's another part of that, him not being able to see, and that's the crowd themselves. The crowd is blocking out Zacchaeus. They're not letting him get to a vantage point. They're taking those special spots for themselves. They want to see Jesus, and they would just as soon Zacchaeus run along. You may know, as if you've been in the church a long time, we often talk about tax collectors and how they are despised in the community. Because tax collectors back then were assigned a certain amount of produce or whatever that they were collecting that they had to get in order to then send it on to the capital in Jerusalem or on to Rome eventually as well. So they were required to get a certain amount. But anything they collected above that, that was their profit. And there was no limit to that. They could, whatever they could get, they could have. And anything above what they had, what they were required to send on, they could still ask for it, and that was their profit. So the more they could get out of people, the better off they were. So they weren't well liked. And perhaps that was part of the crowd's resentment. It's Zacchaeus, the old tax collector, like I'm going to let him in here. And so he's excluded as much by the crowd as it is a problem of his height, and he needs a better vantage point. But he does want to see Jesus. He wants to have that experience. He thinks that's important for him. And so as we see that, perhaps we can relate, as I was talking to the children, perhaps there's times when you're in Zacchaeus' state, not because you're short, but because you're excluded. That somebody's saying, you're different, or you're not one of us, and we don't like you because of, and then they make up something that you're like, wow, that makes me not part of you. You don't like me because of that. I don't think you're seeing all of me. But there are times when I think that we do feel closed out ourselves and set apart and excluded, being part of those that don't get the real part, that aren't worthy enough in the eyes of everybody else. And I think it starts at a very early age. We were talking about this with my sister-in-law yesterday, and she has worked in an elementary school. Says, yeah, they come first graders, they pretty much accept everybody, Oh yes, Jimmy, he's just different, but he's part of the group. Says, but by third grade, they start to make alliances and say, well, we're part of the good group, and now Jimmy, he's not just different, he's not good. And so we start to put him down. And we do that just, I think, for the rest of our lives in different ways. And part of the security is wanting to be part of the in-group. And so we will make those groups just to know we're in, to so that we don't feel rejected. So we protect ourselves from the rejection of others by being part of that in-group. If they're excluded, well, at least it's not me. It's okay to do that. And we do it in, I think, so many different areas of life. We have those exclusions, and when you feel it, it's really hard for us at times. I had a member in my church in Southington, and she was talking about going to a friend's funeral in New Britain. And when she got there, it was a Roman Catholic church, and a very conservative Roman Catholic church, and they were doing the funeral service. And when it got time for communion, the priest said, anybody that's not Roman Catholic should leave the sanctuary now. And you can stand out in the parking lot until we're ready to go to the cemetery. But you're not allowed to be in here during communion. My member was livid from that experience. She just, talk about exclusion. You can't even sit. It's not that you can't receive communion. You can't even sit here and watch us receive it. It's 40 degrees out. You go outside and stand in the parking lot until we're ready to move on. It really accentuates who's in and who's out. And so we do that at different times. They're just different experiences that make us feel excluded. When Karen was in medical school, we used to get together with some of the couples, and one of her good friends, Jennifer, from medical school, would get together with her husband, Tom, and I, and we used to have a rule as the evening went on, and there were points where Tom and I, as non-medical people, could call a technical foul and say, okay, there's no more medical talk from here on out, because you're excluding us. You guys know all the insider information. You know all the terms. We're going to call a little foul on you and say, okay, it's time to open up this conversation. But sometimes you can have that. People will exclude you from the conversation in different ways, by using a terminology, by turning their backs on you, whatever. So I'm just saying that what Zacchaeus, I think, experienced is not just a problem with being a tax collector, and it's not just a problem with being short. It's being, I think, experiencing something that's more universal. Being on the outside, being excluded, having everybody else turn their back on you and not say, you're not good enough to see Jesus. We're going to prevent that from happening. And so he goes to find a way around their exclusion, and he goes up in that tree. And as he's sitting there in the tree, finally getting that experience to see Jesus, what happens? Jesus sees him. All the crowd was trying to, you're not good enough to see Jesus, you're a tax collector. He finds a way to do it, but Jesus spots him and pays attention to him and includes him and says, Zacchaeus, it's your lucky day. I'm coming to your house for a party tonight. I'm going to have dinner with you. And so Jesus recognizes him and says, no, you are not an outsider. I'm coming to your house. And what happens when that happens? The crowd, it says, gets really angry and grumpy. And they grump about, what is Jesus doing going to somebody like that? He shouldn't be associating with them. He's not the right kind of person to be associating with Jesus, to be welcoming Jesus, to even host Jesus, to have that kind of privilege. What is going on here? And everything we think is turning upside down. And so the crowd is angry at Jesus for doing that. And yet, I think as we see this, and Jesus is going to Zacchaeus' house, Zacchaeus kind of, do you get this? It was a little bit different in today's reading. And I think if you look at different translations, you'll find this. I didn't really see it this year until I was listening again to somebody talk about this passage and say the difference. But oftentimes we think that what happens is Jesus says, I'm going to your house, Zacchaeus. And he goes and has dinner with Zacchaeus. And because of Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus changes. And he says, from now on, I'm going to give half of what I possess to the poor, and if I offend everybody, I'm going to restore it 4 times. And that's oftentimes the way we think about it, that it's part of that encounter with Jesus that changes Zacchaeus here. That's the way it was in some translations, but in others, and as I was listening to this commentary this week, they say the better translation is how we hear it today. Zacchaeus hears the crowd complaining about Jesus eating with Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus says, this is what I already do. I already give half of what I own to the poor. And if I wrong anybody, I give them 4 times that amount. So it's not Zacchaeus changing. Zacchaeus already does that. And nobody knows it. Nobody will recognize it. Nobody gives him credit for it. No, he's just that evil tax collector. But Jesus, I think, understood that. Yes, Zacchaeus was different. Yes, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, but Zacchaeus had gifts to offer. Zacchaeus was basically a good person. Yes, doing some awful work, maybe collaborating with the Romans and being a tax collector, but he wasn't taking advantage of that. He was giving half of what he owned to the poor. So it wasn't requiring Zacchaeus to change in order to be worthy of receiving Jesus. Zacchaeus was already like that. And Jesus was just recognizing it. You are already a son of Abraham. So I think that's really important when we think of ourselves as the outcast, as the ones that the outsiders. Yeah, the inside group would like you to change before they'll let you in, right? You're an outsider as long as you're like that. If you'll change and be like us, then you can come inside. Then you can be one of us. But Jesus isn't saying that. No, you're an insider already. And it's important to recognize that. He's expanded that vision of who is welcomed in. Even this tax collector is part of God's chosen people, part of the family of Abraham, as Jesus designates him today. And he is a gifted person. He might not be like you. He's not perfect, nor are you. But he is still one of God's children and has gifts to share. If the community will let him in, and if the community will recognize him. That's what is going on here for this Zacchaeus, who is excluded by the crowd and desperately wanting to see Jesus. Jesus spots him and says, yes, you are part of the family of Abraham. And we're not waiting for you to change. You are that already. When we wait for somebody to change, right, it's like victimizing the marginalized. Oh yeah, you're still a bad person as long as you're you. But if you'll change this, then I can like you. No, you're loved already. And you have gifts to share. So I think this is not so much a challenge to Zacchaeus and the tax collectors to meet Jesus and be changed. I think this story is a story addressed to the crowd, to those that are grumbling, saying, what are you doing to this child of Abraham who wants to see Jesus, and you're pushing him back and turning your backs on him and not letting him be part of that family, not recognizing that he's part of that family. Let him in. I'm going to his house tonight to eat. That's where the party is. And expanding that, moving that line, as I was showing the children this morning, taking away that line. We're all part of it. And I think that is our challenge is to let others in because they have gifts to share. Look at Zacchaeus. He was a generous person in his community. He was wealthy, but he was generous. He gave 50% of everything he owned. And anybody he wronged in his work, he was restoring 4 times what he had wronged them to them. He had gifts that he was giving to the community. They just weren't being recognized. They just weren't being accepted. He wasn't being allowed to be seen as a worthy person, as a child of faith. I experienced that with a couple of my seminary friends, my divinity school friends. It was a small group of 4 of us, 5 of us that hung out together, and 2 of them in particular have had experiences. Mark was one of the ones that went to the North Carolina conference with me following graduation. He was at a church in Rocky Mount. I was in the church in Durham. And at an annual conference, we would get together and keep our relationship going. He was very successful with his ministry in Rocky Mount. The church loved him. And then, as it happened, he discovered, not knowing it beforehand, that he was gay. And in 1986, that would have been, in the Methodist Church in North Carolina, that's not going to happen. And so even though he'd been through the whole ordination process where the church examines him to see if he's that God really called him into the ministry, where the church examines him to make sure he's got the right gifts and graces to serve in the church. Despite going through all that process, the minute that he discovered he was gay, suddenly all of those determinations have invalidated him. And even though he was having great gifts that he was sharing with his church, and his church loved him as a minister, he could no longer function that way. So he left the ministry and went into counseling instead. Those gifts that he had to share were excluded because the community turned its back on him and said, "You're different, you can't be part of us." Arthur experienced it more of a generation later. He was in the Western North Carolina Conference, just retired this year, and his youngest child, Sarah, was lesbian, but she felt a call to the ministry and went to Boston University to seminary. And just graduated the last, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, and again faced the same problems that the Methodist Church continues to have with homosexuality. And so just a month ago, in the beginning of October, Sarah was ordained in the United Church of Christ. The United Methodist Church turned us back. We welcomed her in. And she's now part of our conference as we made the Tri-Conference. Instead of being part of Massachusetts, she's now part of the Southern New England Conference with us. And so the gifts that she has to share are welcomed here because we don't recognize that line. We don't do that exclusion. And so that is the challenge here of the story of Zacchaeus. It's not to grow taller. It's not to say you have to be recognized by Jesus in order to then have him encounter you and you to change and become right. No, it's about somebody that was excluded. And the crowd that did it. And the crowd that wanted to have no part of him. And the crowd that wouldn't let his gifts be used for the community. And I am so grateful to be part of the United Church of Christ that welcomes all who have the gifts for ministry into ordination. I am so proud to be part of this congregation, that we come together and the children come, and it's one of the few places in our world anymore where we can gather intergenerationally. And I can see it happening when we go up to coffee and some of these children come around and they are greeted by you. And you don't know if that makes a difference in their lives, that you recognize them, that you welcome them, that you love them. That makes a difference. And it is a wonderful thing about our community. It is a wonderful thing that we say it at the beginning, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. But it's a wonderful thing when we put that into practice. When we do start seeing who can't see, who do we need to make room for? What do we need to change in order for their gifts to be shared here? This church is like that. And I love it. That's why when I make a pledge today, when I give my gift, I'm supporting something real. I'm supporting something that makes a difference in the lives of people. I'm supporting a place that's different from out there, where people are excluded all the time. Sometimes us. You can think about the places where maybe you don't feel welcome or somebody makes you feel less than good enough. So come here and know you're loved. And show others they're loved. And know that that is our possibility and our gift.